name is Steve Collins, and I was born on December 31st in 1960. I was born in Louisville, and then my family moved from there to Versailles, Kentucky after my father graduated from dental school. And then when my mother was lieutenant governor and governor, we moved to Frankfort, and then I moved back to Versailles after her term of office ended, and lived there until I moved to Shelbyville in 1991, and I have lived in Shelbyville since then. So far, the first and only female governor of Kentucky, and she also currently is the senior former female governor in the United States. There were 5 women who had been elected governor prior to her in other states, 2 of whom did not follow their husbands into office. She was the 3rd that did not follow her husband into office. All of the female governors that had predated her term have all died, and so she currently is the senior former female governor in the country. My mother first got involved in politics actually campaigning for other candidates, Wendell Ford and Dee Huddleston. And when Wendell Ford was running for governor, she was a coordinator for the counties in what at that time was the 6th Congressional District. And then when Dee Huddleston ran for U.S. Senate in 1972, she was the state chairwoman of his campaign. And then she worked in Democratic headquarters, and then in 1975 she ran for clerk of the Court of Appeals and won. In 1979 she ran for lieutenant governor, and then in 1983 she ran for governor. During the time that she was involved in politics, working for other candidates, and then of course campaigning for her own elections, she and my father would involve my sister and me. We started out when we were about 10 years old and 7 years old, going to events all over the state of Kentucky. I think the first time I was in Fancy Farm was in 1971, which is the picnic in Graves County, where candidates quite often kick off their fall campaigns, and that's still going on today. But we were involved in campaigning. We didn't go on every trip to every county that they went on, but we went on enough to know that we were involved, and that it was a very good experience for us. Well, my grandmother actually was born in Spencer County, in the Little Mount neighborhood. Her mother grew up on Briar Ridge, and her father was originally from Mount Eden. And so we have had a lot of family connections, a lot of family history in Spencer County. Some of her ancestors were some of the original settlers of what is now Spencer County, actually settling here when it was still part of Nelson County and still part of Shelby County. My grandmother's maiden name was Taylor. Her name was Mary Taylor. My grandfather's name was Everett Hall. In the 1920s, my great-grandfather left Spencer County because he wanted all of his children to be able to graduate from high school. And they lived at that time on Briar Ridge on my great-great-grandfather Goodwin's farm. And he had an older son who was going to high school, and he came to Taylorsville to live with an uncle. And then the second oldest child, my great aunt, went to Mount Eden to live with an aunt in Mount Eden, so they would be closer to school. Because where they were located in Spencer County, it was about 8 miles to Taylorsville, and it was about 8 miles to Mount Eden. So it was difficult to be able to take a horse or horses and take them to a school and tie them up all day. It was just, and they would have to get up so early, and they would get home late because of the way they had to travel in those days. So he wanted to move so that they would be able to, all of his 10 children would be able to attend high school and graduate, which they did, and I think 6 out of the 10 actually went to college. So he was very forward-thinking in those days, and he made that possible for them. We opened the funeral home here in 1998. We purchased this building in 1996 and did some extensive renovation to it, and then opened the funeral home in July of 1998. And since 1998, there have been quite a few changes in the funeral service industry in Spencer County. When we first opened the funeral home here, it was not uncommon to have 2 days of visitation, starting as early as 9 in the morning, going until 9 at night for 2 days, and then having the funeral on the afternoon of the third day. Attendance also was larger at funerals in those days, in the earlier days, than it is today. I think COVID has a little bit to do with that. I can remember even when I was young and my grandparents were in the business, my grandparents actually had signs that they would provide to local businesses, and local businesses would put a sign up, closed for the funeral of, and write the person's name in, and people would close their businesses to attend a funeral. People who are going to do burials, earth burials in a cemetery, most of the time we still form a procession and go to the cemetery. It's very rare that we don't do that. We do see more cremation now than we did. Quite often, the cremated remains are scattered, or they may be kept in an urn at home or at some other location as opposed to being buried. We do more personalization with displays and with photographs. That was not done when my grandparents were in the funeral business, and that has gradually increased. We see more services on one day where people have visitation in the morning and then go into the funeral in the afternoon, as opposed to having a separate day or separate days of visitation. With cremation, we see memorial services where we still have visitation, we still have a service. The only difference is that we have an urn as opposed to a casket. And if people are using the terms correctly, a memorial service is when you have a service where the body is not present. A funeral is a service where the body is present. Well, with respect to the funeral industry, when the COVID pandemic really became prevalent and restrictions were imposed, we had to limit the number of people who could attend. Initially, it was 5 people, and that included your pallbearers. It was exclusive of the minister and the funeral home staff, but visitations and funerals were limited to 10 people. It had to be the same 10 people. You couldn't run shifts of 10 people, allow 10 people to come in and go out, and then allow another 10 people to come in. You had to limit it to 10 people. After the restrictions were completely lifted, we noticed that while attendance resumed at funerals and visitations, it still is not as large as it was prior to the pandemic. There have been lots of causes of death through the years that create, I think, emotion. I think when you talk about being on the front line, as funeral directors and embalmers, we were actually going into homes, into hospitals, into nursing homes where COVID was rampant and exposing ourselves to that. So we had to take a lot of precautions when we did that, and when we were actually doing the embalming procedures and casketing procedures, just to make things safe for our staff and also for people who came to the funeral home. We took a lot of precautions during that time. My grandparents bought a funeral business in Shelbyville back in the 1940s, and they operated the funeral home in Shelbyville. My grandfather passed away in 1991, and then in 1996, my grandmother was still living when we purchased this building and opened the funeral home. But they did not operate it before I was involved in the business. I can remember one lesson that I learned from my grandparents is that every person who dies at some point in their life was somebody's child, somebody's baby, and we want to take care of that person just like they were our child, like they were our family member. Well, while we still really think of Shelbyville as being a small town and retaining a lot of its small town charm and character, it's certainly grown in the last 20 years, and it certainly is larger than Taylorsville. But there definitely were noticeable differences when we first opened the business here. But when we opened the funeral home in 1998, it was much more commonplace to see 2 nights of visitation, funeral on the 3rd day in Taylorsville and in Spencer County than it was in Shelbyville at the time. The visitation times in Spencer County were longer than the usual visitation times prior to funerals in Shelbyville. So there definitely were differences. Well, there are probably a lot of things. I think one of the most important thing is that when you do a funeral, people are only going to have one, and it's so important to make it as nice and as memorable as you possibly can for the family and for people who attend, just to make it as special and comfortable a time as it is for people who are going through a very difficult time in their lives. I think it's important for people to realize that the funeral business is sort of unique because we don't schedule. We respond to schedules, and we are often working very long hours, and on weekends and holidays we do not get to completely close the funeral homes. Funerals are a very important part of our life cycle, and it's a very important time to remember a life that is lived, to honor a life that is lived, and to give some meaning to that, and also to provide a meaningful experience to the people who have suffered that death, who have lost a family member or friend. This is one of the older buildings in Taylorsville and in Spencer County. We believe that it was constructed between 1836 and 1837, and it was built as a stagecoach stop. And the stagecoach would run through here from Louisville to Bardstown, on to Elizabethtown. The stagecoach would come from Frankfort down through Taylorsville to go to Shepherdsville or to other locations. And so people would actually be able to come here. They would be able to eat and have a room, and then another stagecoach would come the next day and pick them up and take them to another destination. After the stagecoach quit running, it was operated as a hotel, and this was a hotel and a dining room, kind of like a restaurant for the community. At one time there was a bell that was located on the roof, and when the meals were ready here, they would ring the bell, and if you wanted to come here and eat, even though you weren't staying here at the hotel, you could come here and eat. The room that we're sitting in now was originally the tavern, so there was actually a bar in this room at one time. A very important stop in Taylorsville in the early days of transportation, and there are a lot of notable people who have visited here, former governors, military leaders have all passed through this building. It was customary back in the early days of campaigning for candidates to travel together, so you would have candidates that were running against each other who would ride in the same buggy to a location. They would get out, they would get on a platform and verbally tear each other to shreds, criticizing each other, drawing the differences between themselves to the attention of anybody that would listen. And of course, large crowds would assemble to hear them speak. This was before radio and before television. And then they would get back in the buggy and they travel to the next destination. Quite often they would stay in the same hotel room or same boarding house room and eat together, and then they would go to another location, get out and make speeches that criticize each other and and they did that for a long time. So I am quite sure that probably a lot of those candidates came through Taylorsville, and probably if they needed to stay somewhere, this would have been the place that they would have stayed. The Spencer House. This was the Spencer House, and then the Foremans and Greenwells operated a funeral home here, and then when the Greenwells opened the funeral home on Reeser Avenue, then the Foremans operated this, and then they sold it to the business to Roy Lutz and Guy Shelburne, and then to the Snyders, and then it closed, and then the Snyders sold the building to us. In the 1930s, it was purchased and it became a funeral home, although in those days it was still customary to do all of the visitations and funerals and even the embalming at home. Funerals would be at home, visitation would be at home or at church. And you would actually come here and make the arrangements, perhaps pick out your caskets at the times for the funerals, but everything else was done primarily in homes and in churches. Gradually, in the 1930s and 40s, more of the funeralization moved into what we think of as funeral homes now. And of course, they had equipped this building to be able to accommodate visitations and funeral services, and then they rented the rooms out upstairs. Well, because of the numbers of people that would attend, it was easier to seat more people. It was easier, I think, a lot of times on some families to have that experience removed from the house and brought to a funeral home. It took a lot of the strain off of the household. You know, you're experiencing a death, and then you have to think about food and have to think about, just the numbers of people that you would have coming in and out of your house. But in the early days, you would actually call the funeral home, and they would come to the house, and they would actually embalm the body. They'd bring the casket to the house. They would, in a lot of those days, a lot of people didn't have electricity, so you'd have coal oil lamps. I've heard some of the older funeral directors talk about carrying the lamps from the door into where the casket was so people could view the body. And of course, if you came into a funeral home in those days, you would probably have electricity, where you would actually have electric lights, and you wouldn't have a lot of inconvenience that you had then. When the visitations were at home, if the funeral wasn't held there the next day, the funeral would probably be held at a person's church, where they were a member of a church. And so the funeral director would take the casket from the house to the church, and then from the church to the cemetery. Now, we have had several people, even in the last 30 years, that have actually had visitations at home. But Taylorsville and Spencer County are very special to me, just because of my grandmother's roots here and the extended family members that we have had here, and the family history that I grew up hearing about. There's a lot of history in Spencer County, and there are so many things that Spencer County can be just very proud of, and we are very pleased and honored to be a part of this community. It's important for future generations to be aware of traditions, to be aware of history, to be aware of the importance of their connections to Spencer County, Shelby County, wherever they live. To also realize that they have an opportunity to make a contribution to their communities, contributions to others that can really improve the quality of life that we all enjoy. And I think to look for those opportunities, to be aware of them, and to take advantage of them. Take service very seriously. I really think that we just need to get back to really dedicating ourselves to any endeavor, anything that we take on, any job that we do, to really do it well, and to take it very seriously, and to always look for opportunities to make a contribution.
1, 2, 3